Good afternoon, everyone. I'm amazed at how much energy there seems to be in this room when it's the last moment, the last presentation, 3 in the afternoon, when exactly you have the most energy, right? So I always love it when I get slotted for these times of the day. It's a challenge, isn't it? So here's the deal. You remember that in the Psalms it says that God gives to her beloved in sleep? Well, if you get that gift during this presentation, take it. I won't be at all offended. So, the topic for this afternoon is women and Eucharist, then and now. So, this is a pretty big topic, and there is no way that I can claim to speak for all women. I'll give you one woman's perspective, and there are a number of other women friends and sisters who think similarly to me, but I can't speak for all women. I want to say up front that I entirely respect that other women have experiences that are very different from mine, and I respect that things that I may have difficulty with, they find very meaningful and very precious to them. And I want to say up front that I don't mean any disrespect if my comments are leading in a different direction. So, just if I may, I'd like to start with a few personal reflections and then turn to the New Testament, of course, and then to some of the archaeological evidence that we have, and then conclude with another personal reflection at the end. So that's the little roadmap for this afternoon. So, to start out with my own personal experience of Eucharist, there have been many, many moments of great joy and delight in Eucharist, and there are many memorable celebrations, and there are so many times when I'm so grateful for our Catholic tradition in which our rituals are so rich. I especially found it that way at my parents' funerals. I sometimes go to other people from other denominations, and the funeral liturgies just leave me cold. Our Eucharistic celebrations are so rich for the big moments in life especially, and I'm so grateful for that, but also in the ordinary time too. But also there have been many, many painful moments, and the Eucharist that should be the source of our unity oftentimes seems to be the source of deep pain, as it's the place where the deep wounds of clericalism and sexism are often most visible for us. As a child, I often played Mass with my siblings. Any of you do that? Yeah, okay, I'm not alone. So I was the oldest of my siblings, so I always got to be the priest. And my mom had a silver wine goblet that made a great chalice, and Necco wafers were perfect for hosts. So in church, in our parish, I helped my mom along with the other women who were part of the altar society. We cleaned and cared for the altar and the sacristy, but what I really wanted to do was to serve at the altar, as the boys in my class did. Of course, in those days, there were no girl altar servers yet. So as I grew up, as I kept getting older, I found other ways to minister at Eucharist. As a teenager, I learned how to play the guitar, and my sister did too, and she and I and a few other friends convinced our pastor to let us have guitar masses on Sunday evenings. He wasn't too crazy about them, and now I can understand why. By the time I was in college, I was privileged to serve as a lector, but as I grew in feminist consciousness, it became more and more difficult for me to minister as a lector unless there was a pastor who was favorable to me changing some of the language to make it more inclusive. And the same was true of music ministry. I couldn't sing Sons of God anymore or Faith of Our Fathers. What about all the daughters of God? What about our mothers and our foremothers whose faith had shaped us? And then I began to be more and more bothered whenever I was at a Eucharistic celebration and there would be no women visible in the ministries, even when such began to be permitted, such as altar servers and lectors and extraordinary ministers of Eucharist. The first time I experienced Eucharist at an Episcopalian church with a woman presiding, it really affected me deeply on a visceral level that's very hard to put into words. I had studied enough theology and scripture by then that I knew there were no obstacles from scripture or theology for women's ordination, and I knew that in the early church there were women who functioned in these roles that today would correspond to that of deacon or priest, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So some of this evidence is likely already known to you, but allow me to share some of the New Testament evidence, then some of the literary and archaeological evidence for women's leadership in roles in Eucharist in the early church. And then I want to speak about the particular ministry of the Word, preaching at Eucharist, from the perspective of a female member of the Order of Preachers. So, is that enough for this afternoon? Okay, go. So, as you know well, the ministerial roles in the early church were quite fluid. And of course, it would take quite some time before there were standardized job descriptions and ordination requisites and rituals. But one of the key words for those who ministered was the verb diakonein, to serve or to minister, and the nouns diakonia, service or ministry, and diakonos, the person who ministered. So that our sense of ministry from the very beginning, of course, is rooted in Jesus's own mission. And you remember that in Mark 10:45 and parallels, Jesus speaks about himself having come not to be served, that's the verb diakonein in there, but to serve, another form of the verb diakonein, and to give his life as a ransom for many. We'll leave the ransom stuff alone for now. We already kind of touched on that this morning, but the main point is Jesus framed his understanding of his mission in terms of diaconal service. And so that verb diakonein, to serve or to minister, the noun diakonia, service or ministry, as we see it used in the New Testament, there's a wide range of meanings that go with it, various forms of diakonia. So in Acts 1:25, when they're choosing Judas's successor, you remember that they speak there about this ministry and apostleship, and they juxtapose the two words, diakonia and apostoles. And so it's a hendiadys, where you use two words to say one concept. So it's apostolic ministry. So it refers to ministry of those who go out, leave home, one sent, apostolos, out to preach and teach, etc. In Act 6, that scene where the widows of the Hellenists are being neglected in the daily diaconia, you remember the solution that the 12 come up with, and that is to choose 7 men from the Greek speakers who will be in charge of diakonia trapezais, the ministry of the table. And then the 12 say, but we're going to hang on to the diakonia tu logu, the ministry of the word. Now that distinction between the two breaks down immediately, because we see Stephen, who's one of the 7 chosen for diakonia of the table. Next thing we see is he's giving 3 chapters worth of a long speech. And Philip, who's one who was chosen to be dedicated to diaconia of the table, by chapter 21, he's called Philip the evangelist, and we see him in chapter 8 evangelizing the Ethiopian eunuch. So you can see these definitions are not hard and rigid, they're very fluid, but my point is that diaconia refers to ministry at the table and ministry of the word. It also refers to financial ministry. So when Paul is taking up the collection for Jerusalem, he speaks of this as a diaconia. But another one that's very interesting is in Luke 8:3. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna, and the other Galilean women are doing financial ministry. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, but diaconia is used to describe financial ministry. And then twice in Acts of the Apostles, Paul uses it to just talk about all of everything that he does as a minister. And then we get the qualifications for who can be a minister in 1 Timothy. And you'll notice right in the middle of that, it says, women also. So the qualifications for diakonoi, that he then describes it, and it's not women, it's not wives of deacons. This literary structure is indicating that he's talking about women who are serving in diaconia. So there's all different things that you do as a diakonos. You can, and I skipped over one, where in Luke's Last Supper scene, Jesus explicitly talks about diaconal service as leadership. He says, the greatest among you must be like the youngest, and the leader like the one who serves. And who is greater, the one who is at table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at table, but I am among you as one who serves. So he equates it with leadership. It refers to apostolic ministry, ministry of the table, ministry of the word, financial ministry. All kinds of ministries are all caught up in that term. It's curious that in the Gospels, the only characters with whom the verb diakonein is associated are women followers of Jesus. So Simon's mother-in-law, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna, and then Martha, the sister of Mary, in Luke 10:38-42. And the evangelists never specify what kind of diaconia is involved in these women's lives. What kind of diaconia are they doing, except for Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and the other Galilean women. In Luke 8:3, he says that they were diaconating out of their resources. And so so you remember the scene where Jesus is preaching and teaching, and the 12 are with him, and he's going from town to town. And Luke says, and Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna, and many other Galilean women are with him, and they are diaconating. It's imperfect, so it's something habitual, out of their huparkanton. Huparkanton refers to monetary resources. And it's not that they're just holding the common purse. Remember, that was Judas's job, according to John 12. But the pronoun is feminine plural. Huparkanton are autais. They're the women's money. They're ministering out of their money. In other words, they're bankrolling the mission. Now, I know you're going to ask all other kinds of questions. Whoa, well, where'd they get their money? And don't do the bad thing of associating Mary Magdalene with the oldest profession in the world, and that's where you think she got her money. As you know, there's nothing in the New Testament that ever indicates that Mary was a sinner, much less a sinner of that nature. So it is true that women did work outside the home in Jesus's day, and they did make money. But what would be unusual is if they had control over their own money. And so then it leads us to wonder about their marital status. Are they widows? Are they, not too usual for a woman to stay single in that culture in that time, but are they widows who have control over their money? The only one we know their marital status is Joanna, who's married to Chuza, who works for Herod. So, but they have money, and they're bankrolling the mission. So these are the only, we don't know what kind of ministry Simon's mother-in-law does. And most people, when they read Simon's mother-in-law getting up and waiting on them after she's healed, the verb there is diakonun, most people think that she started fixing dinner. And most people think that's what Martha's doing, is worried about what she's going to serve for dinner, and Mary isn't helping her. But with all the other nuances of diakonane, it's very possible that it's preserving the memory for us of women who were in diaconal ministries. With Simon's mother-in-law, if we had enough time, I'd take you through step by step, but the bottom line is that the research of Elaine Wainwright has shown that behind the story of the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, it's likely that there was a call story, and that the two were interwoven. They have similar forms, and that by the time it landed in print, the one that came to the fore was the healing story. But it's very possible that behind that we have a call story of a woman disciple. The parallels are very strong between the story of Simon's mother-in-law and the call of Matthew, the tax collector, in Matthew's gospel. And in Matthew's version, her response is she got up and she began to, or continued to, minister, and the pronoun is different in Matthew. It's to him. It's third person singular. It's to Jesus. And so the response to Jesus for a disciple always entails following and ministering. And so put a question mark around the picture you're framing of Simon's mother-in-law if you have her just serving dinner. Also the same thing with Martha. It could be that this is a scene in which the disputes about women's involvement in ministry is being played out in the story, and that it's really reflecting the historical situation of Luke's day of disputes about whether or not women ought to be involved in the diaconal ministries outside their home. And so I wish we had more time. We could go through the details of those scenes, but my major point that I'd like you to take away is that the only characters in the Gospels with which the verb diakonane is associated, besides Jesus, are these women. One person in Paul's letters is quite notable, and that's Phoebe, who's the only person that is named as diakonos in any of the New Testament. And it's curious that it's the masculine form of the word. So Paul, at the end of his letter to the Romans, says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a diakonos of the church at Cenchreae. Now, if your biblical geography is a little rusty, I put a map up there for you. So you can see that Cenchreae is one of the port cities of Corinth. And so Phoebe is the deacon of that city. And then it goes on to say, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints, and help her in whatever she may require from you. For she has been, and here the word is prostatis. She has been a prostatis of many, and myself as well. That word is translated in various different ways. The RSV translates it, she's been a helper. The NEB, a good friend. The NIV, a great help. NRSV and NAB, she's been a benefactor. Some of those really don't capture the importance of what Phoebe was doing as prostatis. Some of them diminish what her actual role was. In Greek literature, the word prostatis refers to political leadership. So leader or ruler would be the more appropriate translation. In the Roman period, it takes on the meaning of the patron of a community. So a patron is somebody who provides funds for the community, grants protection, uses their political influence on behalf of the community. And so perhaps a better translation of Romans 16:2 would be, for she has become a leader or a presider of many, and Paul adds, and of myself as well. That's a rather startling thing for Paul to say, to acknowledge the leadership of an influential woman in the church at Cenchreae, especially when he himself had spent so long in Corinth himself. I wonder, we don't have the evidence, but we have to wonder. So what was Phoebe's job description? What did she do as diakonos of the church at Cenchreae? And how did she lead? What did she do as she was a presider or a leader over the congregation? I think we'd be on solid ground to say at least that she coordinated the care for the community's spiritual and pastoral needs. A big question as regards Eucharist, did she preside over the liturgical celebrations in her home, in her church, in her local church? Was she the one that provided or ensured that there would be good theological education for the community and that they would have missionary outreach? So she is the leader of the church at Cenchreae, but there are also a number of other women in the New Testament, Paul's letters, especially in Acts of the Apostles, that mention explicitly that there are women leaders of early Christian communities. So Nympha, in Paul's letter to the Colossians, he says, "Give my greetings to the brothers and sisters in Laodicea, and to Nympha and the church in her house." And Prisca, similar greetings in Paul's letters, and also references to her in Acts of the Apostles. But it's clear that she and her husband Aquila are the leaders of the house church, first in Corinth, where Paul meets them, but then when they go to Ephesus, and probably are the ones who establish the church there before Paul comes back to Ephesus himself. Lydia in the church at Philippi, and Mary, who was the mother of John Mark, and she is leading. It's to her house that Peter comes when he's sprung from prison, and they're praying in the house of Mary. Mary of Bethany when Luke introduces. Sorry, I meant to put Martha of Bethany there, Mary's sister. Those two are so confusing, they are just so, they look like each other, you keep getting them mixed up. Anyways, Luke 10:38 starts out with Martha welcomed Jesus into her home. I think it's hinting that she's head of a house church there. Maybe Chloe, who's the messenger in 1 Corinthians 1:11, maybe she was head of a house church, but I'd say probably Evodia and Syntyche in Philippians 4 are also heads of a house church. You remember in the letter that Paul is urging them to be of the same mind, and he's asking for these women to be helped. And he says, they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel. That's a really strong word that he uses. It's sun ethlesan. Sun is with, do you hear athletic in that word? Sun ethlesan. So they've been struggling like an athlete, using every ounce of their energy alongside Paul, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. But there's some disagreement between them. We don't know the nature of it. Please resist the temptation to imagine that it was some silly petty squabble, as some stereotypes of women's disagreements get read into the scene. These are leaders probably of two different house churches in Philippi, and whatever their disagreement is, whether it's theological or over a pastoral approach, or a liturgical matter, their conflict is affecting the whole of the community, which is why it rises to the level of something that Paul will put in the letter that's going to be read to the whole assembly. And so they are also possibly heads of house churches, although Paul doesn't explicitly say so. I want to shift over into some of the archaeological evidence that we have for women who in the early church exercised roles that today would correspond to that of deacon, presbyter, and bishop. Let me also just recall with you that this morning we talked about how in the early church the understanding of Eucharist was as a family meal. So when it's a family meal, you've got the heads of the house presiding over it. When we begin to shift to a cultic understanding of Eucharist and start using sacrificial language, then the person who presides then will need to be a priest to preside over the cult. So as we look to the archaeological evidence, we have both inscriptions and other kinds of material remains from archaeology that point to quite a cadre of women who had been exercising these kinds of roles in the early church. This map, and I know you can't see all the details of it, but just if you look at all the red dots, some have P, some have D, and so the D ones are every place that an inscription or a piece of evidence has been found for a woman who was exercising the ministry of diakonos, and the P for presbyteros, or priest. And so let's take a look at some of these things. First of all, a good deal of the evidence the inscriptional evidence has been gathered by Bernadette Bruton, who examined 19 Greek and Latin inscriptions from the year 27 BCE to the 6th century CE, from all around, from Italy, Asia Minor, Egypt, and Palestine. And what she found in these inscriptions is that these are the kinds of titles that women had. Some were called head of synagogue, leader, elder, mother of the synagogue, and most interesting, priest or priestess. These are just all, there's no particular order in terms of chronology or place, but these are all scattered examples from all around the known world in the early centuries. So what you're looking at are some clay figurines that were found on the road halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, near where the 5th century church of the Kathisma was recently found. And these little clay figurines date from 900 to 600 BCE. And what they're depicting is these are women who have in their hands, the one on the far left has a hand drum, one of them has a flute, another one has a stringed instrument. And what they're depicting is these were women who were leading worship, leading music ministry in the worship, and now notice this is from Old Testament times, so these are Old Testament period figurines, not New Testament. Let's move back into the New Testament. Uta Eisen, another New Testament scholar, has studied tomb epigraphs and letters and inscriptions, and found very similar to Bernadette Bruton's research that women bore the titles of apostle, prophet, teacher of theology, presbyter, enrolled widows, deacons, bishops, stewards. Some people have objected and said, well, they were probably wives of priests, bishops, deacons, presbyters, etc. But the evidence is quite compelling in the opposite direction, that it's the women themselves who held these titles. This is an image of women building the church that's a fresco from the catacomb of San Gennaro in Naples from the 3rd or 4th century. And it is evocative, I think, of the 2nd century work of the shepherd of Hermas, where Hermas has a vision of women who are building the church. And so where I'm going with this is that through the leadership ministries of women, they are literally constructing the early church. This is an inscription from a tombstone in Sicily that dates to the mid-4th to the mid-5th century. And I don't know if you, well, certainly the Greek is big enough for you to read, right? So you got that part. But if you're struggling, in ancient days, they always used capital letters and no spaces between the words, so it's a little harder to make it out. So somebody has transcribed it below in lowercase Greek, but let's try the English one. Here lies Kale, the presbyter, who lived 50 years irreproachably, and she, thank you, ended life on the 14th of September. So this is Kale, the presbyter. The work of Giorgio Otranto, who was an Italian historian of early church history who just died in 2023, has studied all of these same kinds of pieces of evidence, and his conclusions are that the practices in the early church were not uniform. So what's new, right? It's the same in our church too. But in some circles, he sees that women exercised ministries that today would correspond to that of a priest. And this endured all the way up until the 6th century, where women who were called presbytere, presbyter or priest, preached, taught, directed, taught, presided. One piece of evidence he found was a letter of Pope Gelasius of Rome that dates to the late 5th century, where he's forbidding women to officiate at the sacred altars. So what does that tell us? Yeah, if you need to forbid it, it's happening. It's not just in case any of y'all are thinking about doing this. It's happening, and so forbidding it. There's another epitaph that he found of a woman named Leda, who is called a presbytera from Calabria from the mid-5th century. Another presbytera called Flavia Vitalia of Salona in Dalmatia that dates to 425. Many presbytera. Two former colleagues of mine, Carolyn Osick and Kevin Madigan. So some of you who studied at CTU, who studied with Lynn and with Kevin. Okay, a few of you know the people I'm talking about. You can also recognize these are their first communion pictures. So they teamed up to do a study. Lynn is a New Testament scholar and Kevin a church historian, and they teamed up to do a study of ordained women in the early church and studied all of the documents that we have that are pertinent to it. And so there is a lot of documentary evidence. Here's another visual for us. Have you been to the Catacomb of Priscilla in Rome? A number of you have, certainly. You would have seen, of course, this fresco called Fraxiopanis in the Catacomb of Priscilla. Dates probably to the end of the 1st century. Can you make out that there are 7 baskets there? Reminiscent for us of the loaves and the fishes miracle, which is, of course, a Eucharistic symbol for the early church. This is probably depicting a Eucharistic vigil that would have been held in the catacombs on the anniversary of a person's death. And notice that the women have their right hands outstretched over the Eucharistic elements. And there aren't any men who are involved in this celebration. In the same Catacomb of Priscilla, there's another part where there's a fresco of a bishop who is ordaining a woman as a priest. And you can just about make out, I think, that the woman is wearing an alb. You can see the white edges beneath the chasuble, and she has an amice around her neck, and the bishop is laying his right hand on her shoulder, and she's holding an open scroll, the scriptures from which she would read and preach. This is the same woman as at the left, and so this is the same woman after she is ordained, and right here she's wearing a veil, that might be attesting to her office as prophet, and she's also wearing a dalmatic, which is the garment of a deacon, and praying in the orans position. And then on the ceiling of this catacomb is a beautiful image of the Good Shepherd, and again reinforcing the ordination theme of the chamber. One more. This is a floor mosaic covering the tomb of Julia Runa, presbyterissa, buried under the floor of the cathedral at Annaba in what is now Algeria. And this may be the earliest picture that we have of a woman officiating at an agape meal. Perhaps we can even say it was a Eucharist. And it's at San Marcellino e Pietro at the Lateran in Rome, and dates to about the 4th century. We also have Vitalia, who's painted on the catacomb of San Gennaro in Naples, probably late 3rd, early 4th century. You can see she's wearing a red chasuble. She's standing at an altar, has her hands raised above 2 cups. There's a flat loaf of bread at her right elbow, and the 2 open books behind her have the names of the evangelists as she is celebrating Liturgy of the Word and Liturgy of the Eucharist. One more deacon. This is an epitaph. Here lies the minister and bride of Christ, Sophia the deacon, the second Phoebe. She fell asleep in peace on the 21st of the month of March, and then it's broken up after that. And this tombstone was found in 1903 on the Mount of Olives, and dates from probably the 4th century. Another tombstone that dates from the 4th or 5th century from Rome is of Alexandra, who lived, and again, this is a little bit interrupted, but she lived more or less 30 years, was laid to rest in peace 15 days before the Collins of August. So Alexandra, again, you can see her with some of the same kind of vestiture that we saw with the woman in the catacomb of Priscilla, and then of course the lambs evocative of the shepherding that a leader does in the early church. One more. Actually, there's 2 women in this image, Veneranda and Petronella. And so this is in the catacomb of Domitilla in Rome. It's sometime after the year 356. And you can see they're both teachers and preachers. There's a codex with ribbon markers near Petronella's left hand, and on the floor is a round case full of scrolls of the books of the Bible with a lid and with a shoulder strap for carrying. So maybe she's also supposed to be an apostle. And one more, Episcopa Theodora. So episkopos, as you know, in Greek means overseer, and it gets to be translated bishop, episkopos. This is definitely the feminine form of it, Episcopa Theodora, and there is an inscription there. It's interesting that the A in Episcopa they've tried to deface it, but it's still there and discernible. And then next to her is Santa Praxedi, and then Mary, the mother of Jesus, and then on the far right, Santa Prudenziana. And this is in the Basilica of Santa Praxede in Rome, dates to about the 9th century. And so Saints Prudenziana and Praxedis were daughters of a Roman family who endowed the first church on this site. The one wearing the crown is Santa Praxedis, and she's also wearing an episcopal cross. And Prudenziana, her sister, is on the far right. Theodora has a square halo, which means she's still alive. And the others are dead, which is why they have round halos. And Theodora is shown as one whose contributions went to the repair or expand of the church, which had originally been founded by Saint Praxedis. The other thing is that she's wearing a coif, that white, what looks like a white veil, which means she's not married. So she's not the wife of an episcopos, if we're trying to undo her being a woman episcopa. And then this image of Paul welcoming Bishop Praxedis is part of a larger scene in which Christ, Peter, and Paul are welcoming the two sisters, Praxedis and Pudenciana, into the heavenly kingdom. And what you don't see in the picture is Pope Pascal I, who built the older basilica of Santa Praxedis in 820, and he was the son of Theodora. And then one last one that I had to throw in is, this was shared with me by my colleague Dawn Noteware, who took this photo in Lithuania, and it's an image of St. Catherine of Siena wearing a bishop's mitre. There's also a long tradition in the church of Jesus' mother Mary being a priest, and this tradition dates over many centuries, and there's many different artistic depictions of Mary as priest. This one's a 6th century mosaic from Croatia, and this devotion to Mary extends from about the 6th century to the 14th century. This Iglesia de Santa Maria de Tajul in Barcelona, sorry, the Ñ came out as a Z on this screen. This computer doesn't know Spanish, evidently. This one dates to the 13th century. And then this one's from the 15th century from France. Again, you can see it's the priesthood of the Virgin. And by 1913, the Vatican thought this was not such a good idea to portray Mary this way and prohibits portraits like this. So we'll scrub those from the PowerPoint for the next time. Let me fast forward to modern day times. And you likely know the story of Ludmila Yavarova, who was in the underground church in Czechoslovakia during the communist era, and Bishop Felix Davidek validly ordained her to minister to the needs of the community during the time of the underground church. The story is told by Miriam Trace Winter in her book Out of the Depths, but as you also likely know, is that she and any other women who have been ordained have been asked not to exercise that ministry, even though those were valid ordinations. I want to switch gears now for a moment and share with you that as a woman member of the Order of Preachers, one of the most painful parts of Eucharist for me is to be a female member of the Order of Preachers and to have almost exclusively male preachers breaking open the Word at Eucharist. So a little personal history. At age 21, I joined the Order of Preachers. We women Dominicans had not yet begun to reclaim our charism of preaching. But as we followed the directives of Vatican II to return to the charism of our founder, we have come to reclaim preaching as the foundation of our mission. Women Dominicans had, more often than not, said that we translate our mission, our charism of preaching, into teaching. So as we begin to reclaim preaching as our charism, there's one big obstacle. The majority of preaching in the church is done at Eucharist, and we're not permitted to preach at Eucharist. So some of us make peace with this anomaly by asserting that we preach always in everything that we do and say. And while that is certainly true, that doesn't resolve the underlying difficulty for us. Others of us have deliberately pursued the study of Scripture and theology and have learned public speaking skills that would prepare us to use our gift for preaching in professional ministries. And then we take every opportunity that we're offered to preach at prayer services, morning and evening prayer, communion services, wakes. Some of us, in collaboration with our brother priests, push the envelope a little further preaching, for example, at our Mother House communities at Eucharist, especially on occasions such as funerals, jubilees, professions of our sisters. Taking this principle to heart, you probably know that the Directory of Masses for Children, promulgated in 1973, allows that one of the adults may speak after the gospel, especially if the priest finds it hard to adapt himself to the mentality of children. So we reason that women religious, as well as other lay women and men, deserve the same consideration as children. That the preacher be one who's able to speak our language. So some dance around the prohibition of lay preaching at Eucharist and call the preaching by lay persons reflections rather than a homily. And in some instances, to keep the letter of the law, the lay reflection will be preceded by a 1 or 2 sentence homily by the priest. But this is not just about women wanting, letting women use our gifts to make us happy. It's really becoming more and more evident that the whole church is poorer from hearing the word broke open week after week, year after year, only from the perspectives of ordained men. And it's a burden on them, too. When a woman preaches, something different often happens within those who hear. Women preachers often see things in the text and in its implications for our lives of faith that are not as apparent to our brothers. For example, a woman breaking open the story of the Canaanite woman who pleads with Jesus to heal her daughter is more likely to identify with the woman rather than with Jesus, and to listen to her own experience of being ignored and shut out by powerful men, to that of the woman in the text. She may be better able to help females in the congregation. The woman preacher may be better able to help females in the congregation relate their experience to the Canaanite woman's persistence, often a woman's most powerful tool in the face of adversity. She may also be able to help the men in the congregation understand an aspect of women's experience that they might not have previously recognized, and then to move more toward being allies in the struggle with women. Women preachers often ask different questions of the text. For example, where were the women and children in the story of the feeding of the 5,000? You know that Mark ends the story with those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. But Matthew concludes that, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, not counting the women and children. And so when women and children are not mentioned in the text, women preachers will more often than not reflect on their overlooked presence and experiences. Women preachers are inclined to explore what effect the text has on contemporary women who hear it. They may ask questions like, what was the reaction of the women who prayed and prophesied in the Corinthian assembly, or that of Deacon Phoebe in Cenchreae, when they heard Paul's letter read to them aloud where he admonished women should be silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak but should be subordinate, as the law says. Would the women have pushed back or simply assented to Paul's instructions? How should contemporary women respond to such a directive? As the church confronts the question of admissibility of lay preachers to break open the word at Eucharist, one key consideration is the biblical foundation for such. There's no question that the ministry of the word was central both to Jesus' mission and to that of his earliest followers. The first thing that Jesus does at the outset of his mission is to preach good news. And when Paul lists the gifts given to the community, he gives first place to apostles, prophets, teachers, those who exercise ministry of the word. As we already mentioned in Acts of the Apostles, the 12 won't give up diakonia tou logou to the newly appointed Hellenist ministers. And in the Gospels and the letters of Paul, we see both women and men followers of Jesus who are depicted as proclaiming the good news. In the early church, of course, There's no lay ordained distinction among those who minister. Those whom Jesus forms for a preaching ministry include not only the 12, but also Galilean women. And in what follows, I will just focus on the women for a few moments, as they are preachers and teachers and prophets in the New Testament. You know their stories. I won't, we don't have time for me to elaborate on them, but let me just flash their pictures, recall them to mind for you. So Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna, they're not only bankrolling the mission, but remember that in the introduction of them in chapter 8 of Luke's Gospel, Jesus and the 12 are preaching. They're on a preaching tour throughout the Galilee, and the women are diaconating with them. And so it's not too much of a stretch of the imagination to think of the women participating in that preaching mission as well. And also I'd want to include the woman of Samaria, who on the basis of her word brings her whole town to belief in Jesus. There are many women who are gifted with before I go to the prophets, let me also just say one more word about Mary Magdalene and the Galilean women disciples. If they weren't preaching with Jesus in Luke 8, certainly by the end of the gospel and in all 4 gospels, Mary Magdalene and other women, disciples of Jesus, are directly commissioned by Jesus to preach, to proclaim the good news to the others. And then the reception of that is varied depending on which gospel you're looking at. There are also a number of women in the New Testament gifted with the gift of prophecy, which is one form of preaching. The prophet Anna, 84 years in the temple, worshiping, fasting, praying, until the moment when she saw the long-awaited Savior, and then she spoke about the child to everybody who would listen. And although Jesus' mother and Elizabeth are not explicitly called prophets, I hear what they say in the gospel. Elizabeth's exclamation about the blessedness of Mary and about how God delights in removing humiliation as prophetic utterances. Certainly the Magnificat is a prophetic utterance that gives voice to God's dream for all human flourishing. And Philip, the evangelist, at the end of Acts in chapter 21, verse 9, it mentions that he has 4 virgin daughters who had the gift of prophecy. And then in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, he mentions women who pray and prophesy in the assembly. That's in chapter 11, verse 1. We've already talked about Phoebe, who was likely also exercising a ministry of preaching as well as presiding. And so, and one more that we haven't talked about yet, Paul mentions Junia in Romans 16:7, who's notable among the apostles. She may have been notable back then, but we know nothing else about her now. But what we would want to pay attention to is that apostolic ministry is normally associated with preaching the gospel. One other woman that Paul greets in Romans 16:3 and 4, and she's also featured in Acts of the Apostles 18, is Prisca, or Luke likes to call her Priscilla. And so Luke recounts how in Ephesus there was an eloquent preacher named Apollos who had come from Alexandria. And when Prisca and Aquila heard him, they noted that he didn't have the story quite right and all there. And so they take him aside and they explain the way of God to him more accurately. And then outside the Gospels, we have the tradition of St. Thecla, who was an apostle who traveled around with Paul. She was from Iconium, or modern-day Konya today. Do you see Konya right on? Do you see the big word Turkey in the center? And Konya's right below it there. So, and she traveled all around with Paul. She became a very popular saint for her preaching and her apostolic ministry. This is a picture of her carved into a column from a Greek temple in the region of Adana, Turkey. We don't know the date of this, but you can see also carved in is her name on either side of her face there. A great devotion to Thecla that endured over the centuries. And then one other who's mentioned in a number of early Christian traditions as an apostle with Paul and was known for her preaching is Nino, who was said to be educated in Jerusalem and then became apostle of Georgia during the reign of Constantine. So, trying to wrap this up, in the Gospels, in Paul's letters, in archaeological evidence, there is a great deal of evidence that says that women were exercising all the ministries that today we associate with ordained ministry, including presiding at Eucharist, including preaching at Eucharist. And so what we also experience, both in the early church, we see it in the New Testament, we see it all through tradition, that there are repeated attempts to restrict and silence women from preaching and to keep women from exercising the presbyteral ministries that were evident in some places during the early centuries of the church. And so those kinds of texts, we always need to put them into historical context and to remember the patriarchal worldview that stood in strong contrast to the reality of how the Spirit was bestowing these gifts on believers without regard to gender and status. So, as the Spirit continues to endow women and men, lay and ordained, with the charism for preaching and presiding, and as lay women and men develop their biblical and theological expertise and rhetorical skills to exercise the gift of preaching, I'm confident that the church will flourish all the more when these gifts are fully welcomed. I do hold out hope. I think that the synodal process into which Pope Francis has invited us holds great hope for us to be a listening church, hearing all of the experience, taking into account all of the evidence of how ministries have been exercised in the early church and all through right till the present. There are still some women who move outside the box and who celebrate women's liturgies and who stretch into ways to use their gifts. Some do it inside the church and some feel they can't stay inside anymore. My prayer is that as we become more and more of a synodal church, that we will be able to welcome all those gifts inside. I'll share with you one thing that a group of us did. There were about 30 of us that met here in St. Louis at Aquinas Institute of Theology. Many of us were Dominicans, but others were lay women and men, experts, theologians, and we studied long and hard the gift of preaching, and we formulated a proposal that we have sent to Rome. We have sent it to the Synod, asking for the church to officially recognize lay preachers as duly commissioned to preach, including at Eucharist. And so we're very hopeful. We've spread that word among many who are going to be voting members of the Synod, and including some of the bishops that we know would be able to listen to what we were saying. So the hope still stays alive. I haven't been able to tell you everything about women in the church because it can't be told. Each individual woman has her own story about why she has to leave or why she stays in, and what she hopes for, what she dreams, and what she hopes for from her brothers as we accompany one another in this grand journey. So let's keep walking together as Pope Francis has invited us, and that's this part of this woman's story about my journey with Eucharist. Thank you. I left you 1 minute for a question or a comment, and I see Jeff wants to take it. Will do. Okay, Jeff is giving us permission to engage a couple questions. Did I read that right, Jeff? Okay. Questions, comments? We have 15 minutes before Eucharist. It's right next door. Yes.
There's been a lot of talk in recent years about women deacons. There's been a couple of commissions. My understanding is the commissions have recommended going forward with that. But the last I heard was the Pope's interview with Nora Roberts, and he seemed to be pretty definitive about that. That's not going to go anyplace. Is that kind of the, I know it's from the Pope, but is that like the last official word, or what's the status of women deacons?
Thank you for asking. He established he first established a commission, I forget what year it was, it's some years ago now. And at the conclusion of it, if I understood it correctly, what happened was that not everybody on the commission agreed. They were studying all over again some of the same evidence that I just raced through with you. Evidence from the New Testament, evidence from inscriptions and archaeological evidence, evidence from tradition. It's crystal clear there were deacons in the early church. There was an official ministry of women deacons in the early church. It's indisputable. The disappointing thing was that, from what I understand, the commission couldn't agree. And so the Pope wouldn't move forward because the commission members didn't all agree. And then sometime after, he established a new commission to take the next step. And I never heard anything that came out of that one. I don't know if others of you had. But the interview with Nora Roberts was just crushing, because I don't know what was happening that day, because it's so totally contrary to the whole spirit of how we're coming together in synodal listening for this synod in October, where he's kept insisting that there are no, don't come with decided end points, and let the Spirit take us to what is emerging. And for him to cut off the discussion of it, it was just really shocking, because it's so antithetical to the whole spirit of where he's been leading us. So I don't know how to explain it, and I don't know what to expect. I'm going to hope that when we get to, well, I'm not going to be there, but we, in the sense of we all are going to be there in spirit. When we get to the synod, I'm hoping that he's going to say, you know what, forget what I said that day. Let's keep going with the work that we were supposed to be doing on this and see where the Spirit takes us. He's one pope that's not afraid to say, I made a mistake, or I'm sorry. He didn't invoke infallibility on that one. Other questions, comments?
To make a comment, while you were talking, I was listening entirely, but I was also thinking back. And the first really good homilist I ever heard was a sister who taught, who preached or did reflections once a month in St. Leo's Church in Columbus, Ohio. The pastor was a very nice man. His homilies were dull. Old Testament history lessons, not very relevant. But once a month, one weekend a month, Sister Margaret, I don't remember his name, but Sister Margaret Scanlon, whose name I still remember, did the reflections one weekend a month. And those were the first good homilies I ever heard in my life. And it stayed with me ever since. And while you were talking, I actually Googled her name, and she's still alive, and she's in the Mother House in New York, and I was like, I'm going to have to write to her and let her know that I did remember her homilies. And they may have been reflections, but they were homilies because they were about the gospel. And they were calling us to relate to the gospel and calling us to follow Jesus. And that's, you can call it a reflection, but that's preaching. And so thank you for letting me remember her.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Well, let me give you enough time to collect yourself before we celebrate Eucharist. Jeff asked me to ask you if you would please take everything with you from the room here as we leave. Thank you so much. God bless.